Hey, what's up? It's Kit. Time for another video. We're talking about braid today. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I talk about the whys and hows of fishing, from ultralight to big game, everything in between, and fly fishing. So yeah, today we're talking about braid, the specifics, and some of the characteristics of braid that you actually need to know and understand. So we have two reels here, and both of them are spooled with braid. Both of them I use for slow jigging, but one is slightly different from the other. This is one of my main reels, and this is spooled with multicolored braid, and this one is actually a casting braid that I use, and this is something that I use for close bottom work. Okay, it's also on the lighter side. This is something that I use on the heavy side. Now, braid has stretch, but a lot of people are not aware of that. That's one characteristic that you need to know. And also the property of the molecules of polyethylene that actually kind of repels coating. And these are the two things that you actually need to understand, because this is where the confusion actually starts. First, the stretch. That's quite important because there's percentages involved, and there are some people that get confused. Okay, so the material itself, okay, polyethylene itself. The material has two brands, okay, Dyneema and Spectra. Kind of the same thing, more like Coke and Pepsi, okay? Very little difference between the two. Dyneema being the first one, and then Spectra followed after, because it was protected, so they had to do something different. Okay, but the fact of the matter is the end result is the same. You get, if you braid it, you get this material. Okay, so polyethylene itself actually has a 2% stretch, which means that if you're fishing, if you only have one strand and you're fishing at 100 meters, there is a stretch factor of 2 meters. Okay, now when you braid that, what happens, because of each company's proprietary style of braiding, the stretch factor actually changes, it increases. Okay, so you get anywhere between 4 and sometimes up to 10% of stretch. It depends on how they're braided. Now, braid like this, when you're pulling it, it actually compresses if there's pressure and relaxes. Now, when you're jigging really fast, what happens also is that it pushes against each other, and that's something very important that we're going to talk about later. So there's the stretch factor, and why that's important is because when you're fishing deep, especially when you're fishing over 100 meters, you need to know exactly how much stretch you need to pull out to get your jig to move. Like I said, at 100 meters, okay, at 4% stretch, you're dealing with already 4 meters. So you have to pull all 4 meters of that line before your jig starts to move. Now remember also that when we're fishing, you're dealing with current, you're dealing with a drifting boat. Your line isn't straight, it actually forms a D. Your job is to take that slack off so that it's straight and it moves your jig. Okay, so if your jig is here, the line forms, you're on the boat right here. Okay, you're on the boat right there. Okay, and this is your jig. Okay, and your line is like that. Okay, you need to pull all that stretch to move the jig. So always remember, 4 to 10%. It depends on the brand. And this is the reason why you have to have a fast reel for slow jigging. Now, slow jigging gets affected more because you're not moving as fast as how you're moving a fast jig. Because remember, when you're doing the jigging motion, you're constantly moving the jig and reeling, which means that you're reeling all that slack and all that stretch onto the reel all the time. But with slow jigging, it's more static. It's not as dynamic. So what you need to do is always be in contact with your jig. So you need a reel that reels in all that slack and all that stretch, and you need a fast reel. We've explained that in the previous video. Now, another thing that affects this drift or the movement of your jig is your leader. Now, in Japan, they actually use thin line. I think they don't use anything over point PE2 for the experts. Because we're not, we can use thicker ones, and actually, well, it depends, still depends on the size of the jig and all that. But I mean, for them, they fight the fish differently. Now, for us, we still use the rod. For them, they just use the reel, and that's quite difficult. Understand that that's totally alien for the rest of the world. Having said that, okay, thinner line cuts through the water more and is not influenced by the water or the current or the drift of the boat, and which is the reason why also this was invented, because they needed a system to actually keep the jig in the strike zone the longest, and this is it. Now, if you're using thick line, remember, the thicker the line, the more the water has influence on it, and the more it's gonna push the line towards the direction of the current. This is why there's a D that forms. So the thinner the line, the less drag it will have in the water. At the end of your braid is your leader. Now remember, leaders are thicker than our braid, and most of the time we use quite big leaders. But remember also that when you're using the thick leaders, the influence of the current on the line is not ideal, because what happens is that it will influence the movement of the jig. So it's either you use something shorter, okay, and thinner, or you're always aware of that stretch, okay? So there's a few ways around that. I'm sure you'll figure it out, and everything just pretty much involves you reeling up that slack. The sacrifice, of course, with thicker braid is that you'll have less time in the strike zone because of the drift, whereas with the smaller or thinner braid, it will linger longer because it cuts through the water more efficiently. So just remember that. Now, leaders, fluorocarbon is used. Fluorocarbon is stiff, okay? So again, something that you have to remember, because it will influence the movement of the jig, which means that if you're using fluorocarbon, if you just want a shortcut, just use a short piece, okay? Because that's gonna give your jig more movement, and that's the most important thing there, is that your jig needs to move in such a way that the fish will eat it. Okay, so that's the stretch part. Now the coating. Okay, the molecules of polyethylene repels dyes, which is the reason why you'll see that most braids will discolor. Now, the main difference between jigging and casting braid is the fact that casting braid, you'll notice, that is more expensive than jigging braid. Not this particular one, because see, the thing is with this particular one, whatever coating you get on the colored line is the same coating as you get with the single lines. Now, if you're curious, this is Suffix 832. Now, this is the Suffix 131. It has 13 strands, and there's one strand of gore fiber in the middle, whereas for 832, it has one strand of gore fiber spiraling in on the braids, and this helps this type of braid actually from rubbing each other, so you get less cut-offs. That's why I like this. For this one, it actually has the gore fiber in the middle, and the gore fiber in the middle prevents the braid from cutting itself when it contracts and compresses. And again, this is why I like them. Now this one is, I know it's a casting braid, so I use this reel for casting from shore. That's one, and if I'm offshore, I could actually use it to work lures on the bottom. And if I'm just working the lures on the bottom, this is what I grab. It's also quite small compared to this one, because I use this in shallower water and in the sand, and you'll probably see me use this in a later video. But that's it. Now the reason why it's casting braid is more expensive is because they have to put several coats, and it's very difficult to actually coat and dye. So imagine, as opposed to a jigging braid where sometimes you'd feel low quality ones are kind of rough, and most likely they just put the color and one coating of the slick material that they put on there, again proprietary, whereas it'll take about 4, 5, 6, 7 coats for the casting braid, because it's for distance, and that's what matters for that particular braid. So that's it. Okay, main takeaway here is that you can actually kind of interchange both. I mean, for me, I have reels that are spooled with the same type of braid for casting, and it's because I can measure distance more accurately with this. Every 10 meters it changes color, so I know the distance that I'm either putting them on when I'm trolling or when I'm casting. I know exactly how far I'm casting, so that's a very big advantage for using multicolored lines. For casting braids, they cast farther, period. That's it. Okay, the roundness, before I forget, the roundness of the braid actually affects how it cuts through the water. Okay, some braids are not round. Okay, what happens is that the braid acts kind of like a weather vane in the water, and it's not consistent, whereas with a totally round one, and this is the whole reason why a lot of emphasis are actually saying that, you know, this braid is round, and it's because of that. It is more hydrodynamically sound than a braid that is oblong, because it will kind of move around. And trust me, when you're actually in deep water, you'll get more drag with a flatter braid than a rounder one. So yeah, that's it. If you have questions or if I missed anything, please comment below, and yeah, let's have a discussion in the comment section. If you have more questions, please just ask away and I'll be happy to answer. If you haven't noticed, I actually answer most, if not all, of the comments in the comment section, so please go ahead and comment. All right, so yeah, that's it for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.